The first time I pulled up to my new cabin, I thought I had finally found peace. It was tucked away near the woods, surrounded by tall trees and fresh mountain air. The kind of place you imagine when you dream of starting over. I had worked hard to get this land, and owning it felt like a reward after years of pushing through struggles. I was ready for quiet mornings on the porch, evenings by the fire, and maybe even making a few friends in the neighborhood. But before I even had time to settle in, someone knocked on my door with a very different kind of welcome. It was a representative from the local HOA, clipboard in hand, and a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. They wasted no time telling me that my little piece of paradise was actually under their control. According to them, there were rules I had to follow, fees I had to pay, and changes I had to make to fit in. At first, I tried to stay polite, even though their tone felt more like a demand than a request. The truth was, I had never agreed to be part of any HOA, and this land had been carefully checked before I bought it. Something about the way they spoke made me feel like this wasn't just about regulations, it was about power. Over the next few days, things got stranger. Letters started showing up in my mailbox, warning me of violations I couldn't even understand. I hadn't even unpacked half my boxes, yet they were already telling me I needed to change the way my cabin looked, where I parked my car, and even how I landscaped my yard. Neighbors whispered that the HOA had a reputation for driving new owners into compliance, no matter the cost. Some gave me sympathetic looks, but no one dared speak too loudly against them. It felt like I had walked into a battle I didn't sign up for. Still, instead of panicking, I stayed calm. Because there was one detail the HOA didn't know when they came knocking on my door, something that completely shifted the power dynamic. You see, while they believed they were in charge, it overlooked a crucial fact about the very land they were trying to control. And when they finally discovered the truth, their confidence turned to silence. The moment they realized I wasn't just another homeowner, but something far more unexpected, everything changed. When I first started looking for a place to call my own, I wasn't searching for anything fancy. I wanted land that was quiet, away from the constant noise of the city, where I could breathe and live at my own pace. That's when I found the Cabina rustic little home with history written into its wooden walls. The land came with it, and after months of paperwork and double-checking records, I made sure everything was legally mine, free from hidden strings. The deed was clear, the boundaries marked, and not a single mention of being tied to an HOA. That was one of the main reasons I chose it. Freedom, independence. No one telling me what I could or couldn't do on my own property, but it didn't take long before I realized this community had its own hidden rules. The HOA here was more than just a group of neighbors. It was like a small empire. They controlled paint colors, mailbox designs, even how tall the grass could grow. People around me seemed used to it, like it was just another part of life. But I could see the unease in their eyes when the subject came up. It was almost like they were too afraid to question it. That made me wonder how many others had been pushed into silence. How many had given up pieces of their land, their freedom, just to avoid conflict. The letters they sent me grew sharper and the visits less friendly. They acted as if they already owned me, as if my cabin was theirs to dictate. But the strange part was, I had no idea about the full story of this property, because what they didn't realize was that their entire HOA sat on land tied back to my deed. And once they found out, their tone completely shifted. The question was, what would they do now that the power had turned? The day I signed the papers for the cabin, I remember sitting with the old owner, a quiet man who had lived there most of his life. He told me stories about the land, how it had been passed down for generations, and how the property lines stretched further than most people thought. At the time, I didn't think much of it. To me, it was just reassurance that I was making a solid investment. But looking back, that conversation feels like the first clue to everything that came later. The HOA kept pressing me, as if they were sure I would eventually cave in. They left notices on my door, reminding me of fines I supposedly owed, and hinted that legal action could follow if I didn't comply. I started to see their pattern. They counted on fear. Most homeowners, especially new ones, probably gave in quickly rather than face the stress. But I wasn't about to be pushed around. Not when I knew the truth they were missing. What they didn't realize was that the HOA had been operating under assumptions for years. They believed they had authority over every cabin and every inch of land in the area. But tucked away in my deed were clauses that told a very different story. My land wasn't just free from their control. It actually overlapped with the very property that gave them their supposed authority in the first place. This meant that while they were busy treating me like just another homeowner under their thumb, the reality was the opposite. Without even knowing it, they had been answering to me all along. Of course, I wasn't ready to reveal that right away. For now, I let them believe they were in charge, all the while watching closely as their own confidence began to crack. The tension kept building like a storm that refused to break. Every week, the HOA sent more letters, each one sounding bolder than the last. They talked about mandatory fees, architectural compliance, and even threatened to take me to court if I didn't fall in line. On the surface, I stayed calm, but inside, I could feel the pressure tightening. They thought they had cornered me, but all the while, I carried the one piece of information that could flip everything upside down. Neighbors began stopping by, some under the pretense of small talk, others with quiet warnings. One older couple whispered that the HOA had driven out a family years ago when they refused to comply. Another neighbor told me about the endless fines they had paid just to keep peace. Everyone seemed trapped in a cycle of control, and the fear in their voices told me this battle was bigger than just me. It was about an entire community living under rules they never truly agreed to. The HOA president finally showed up at my door. This time, without the fake smile. His words were sharp, his tone meant to intimidate. He told me I was already in violation and that the board would be meeting soon to decide what to do about me. I stood there, listening, letting him believe his authority meant something. But behind my silence was the weight of the deed locked safely in my drawer, the very document that undercut every threat he made. By then, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. They had built their power on shaky ground, and with one revelation, everything they stood on could collapse. The only question was how far they were willing to push me before I finally laid my cards on the table. And with their demands growing louder and their pressure heavier, the breaking point was getting closer than ever. Just when I thought I had the upper hand, the HOA made a move I didn't see coming. Instead of backing off, they doubled down. One morning, I walked outside to find a notice staked into my yard in bold red letters. It wasn't just another warning. It claimed that my cabin itself was built in violation of community standards and might even be subject to removal. The idea was absurd, but the message was clear. They were willing to escalate this fight as far as it could go. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. The HOA wasn't acting out of simple stubbornness. They were afraid. I started digging through old records, visiting the county office, speaking to people who had lived in the area long before the HOA existed. The deeper I went, the more I uncovered a pattern of intimidation, questionable paperwork, and a history that didn't line up with the authority they claimed to have. They had been bluffing for years, hoping no one would question it. But the more I learned, the stranger things got. Buried in the files was a detail that changed everything. The HOA's power wasn't just shaky, it was borrowed. Decades ago, the organization had tied its legitimacy to a single piece of land, a parcel that connected all the properties in the community under their control. And that very parcel was written directly into my deed. It wasn't just that they couldn't control my land, it was that, without my land, they might not exist at all. Suddenly, the game was no longer about fines or paint colors. It was about survival. The HOA wasn't just trying to pressure me into compliance. They were fighting to keep their entire empire from crumbling. And now that I knew the truth, I also knew they wouldn't stop until one of us broke. The day of the HOA board meeting arrived, and I decided it was time to stop playing along. They had summoned me as if I were some tenant who owed them answers. But I walked into that room with the deed tucked neatly into my folder. The board members sat in a row, their papers stacked high, their faces stern and certain. The president wasted no time declaring me non-compliant and announcing the penalties they intended to enforce. The room was heavy with their confidence, but I knew that weight was about to shift. I let them speak, nodding as if I were listening carefully. Then, when the silence finally fell, I slid the deed across the table. My voice was calm but steady as I pointed out the section that tied their entire authority back to my property. At first, they brushed it off, but as their eyes scanned the words, the color drained from their faces. The very ground their rules were built on wasn't theirs, was mine. Without my land, their HOA charter had no legal standing. The room grew quiet. The board members glancing at each other, their carefully rehearsed control unraveling. For the first time, they weren't the ones holding the power. I reminded them of the notices, the threats, and the intimidation, then explained what it all meant in light of the deed. Their empire had been running on borrowed ground, and now the landlord had come home. But just when I thought the fight was over, one more twist came to light. Buried in their own files was a clause they had overlooked, one that gave me not just the authority to walk away from their rules, but the option to dissolve the HOA entirely if I chose. The very organization that had tried to strip away my freedom now depended on my decision for its survival. And in that moment, the question wasn't just whether I had won it, was what I would do with all the power now in my hands. The room stayed silent after I revealed the final clause. And for the first time, the HOA board had nothing to say. They sat frozen, realizing that the very rules they had used for years to control others could be erased with a single choice. I could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else: relief. It was as if even they were tired of carrying the weight of power built on shaky ground. I didn't need to raise my voice or threaten them. The truth itself was enough to bring everything into balance. In the days that followed, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact began stopping by, curious to know what really happened inside that meeting. When I explained, many of them admitted they had lived under the HOA's pressure for years, paying fees and following rules they never wanted. Some even thanked me, saying they wished they had stood up long ago. What surprised me most was how united the community suddenly felt once the fear was gone. I chose not to dissolve the HOA completely, but I made it clear that things were going to change. The old system of control and intimidation was over. If it was going to exist at all, it would be rebuilt as something fair, transparent, and optional. No one would be forced into rules they didn't agree with, and no one would lose their peace over a patch of grass or the color of a cabin wall. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the trees, I realized this story wasn't just about land or power, was about choice. Owning the cabin gave me freedom, but standing up for it gave others the courage to claim their own. And in the end, that was the real victory.